My name is Leah. I'm the Knowledge Exchange Coordinator here at Women's Shelters Canada, and I'm going to be moderating today's webinar. I'm really excited to be here and to be with you today for this really interesting conversation that we're about to have. um, I do want to start by acknowledging that I'm joining you today from the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. I know there are people joining us today from across Turtle Island. That's the beauty of these remote virtual events. And so feel free to let us know where you're joining from in the chat if you want to. And when you do that, you are welcome to set your chat to all panelists and attendees if you would like everyone to see it. If you leave it at all panelists, just the presenters and I will see it. Yeah, so feel free to introduce yourself, share where you're joining from. And if you're not sure what territory you're on, I encourage you to take this as a moment or a prompt to find out and to learn a little bit more about the context of the land you're on and the people whose land it is. So before we get into further conversation on our topic today, a few little housekeeping reminders. Our presentation today will be in English. If you want to continue listening in English, you can leave things as they are. Pour celles qui veulent écouter en français, veuillez cliquer sur le bouton Interprétation en dessous de votre écran et sélectionner l'option French ou Français et vous allez entendre l'interprète en français. And if you have any questions about that or technical difficulties, you can just let me know in the chat and I will do my best to address them. And once I'm done with these housekeeping reminders, I'll share those instructions in the chat as well. So you've probably noticed you can only see and hear the presenters today, and that's just because we have quite a few people with us today, more than 50 already, and there's still more people coming. And we want to make sure everyone can see and hear. So to make sure that works smoothly, we've sort of limited who has video and audio. But that doesn't mean we don't want your participation. We definitely want your input into this session. And so what you can do for that is you can use the chat and the Q&A that are at the bottom of your screen. You can use the chat for comments, to introduce yourself, for things like that. If you have a question that you want to ask the presenters, we ask you to put that in the Q&A box. And that just helps us keep track of those questions, keeps them all in one spot so that we can make sure we get to as many of your questions as possible at the end of today's discussion. And we will be getting to those questions at the end. As you know, we're talking today about, some different approaches to transitional housing for survivors of VAW, and we'll be looking at two approaches in particular. Now, as many of you know, and I can share a link to this, Women's Shelters Canada did release a report on second stage shelters in Canada earlier this year, which really showed how important the work of second stage shelters is, as well as, contributing to past research that has shown how urgent the need is for more longer-term supportive housing options for survivors of domestic violence. And so we thought it would be really interesting to take a closer look today at some of the different models or approaches to that kind of longer-term support for survivors. So our first speaker, who will get started in just a minute, is Julie DeMarchi. And she is the executive director of Timmins and Area Women in Crisis. And she'll be telling us about their second stage housing program and how it emerged sort of through a unique partnership that she'll tell us more about. And then we'll hear from Linda Olsen, who is the housing director with the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And Linda is going to tell us about their domestic violence housing first approach. Linda's our first international guest for a webinar, so we're very excited to have her here with us today. And then we'll have a question period, and you can ask questions of Linda and Julie. And so throughout today's webinar, feel free to put your questions into the chat. Now, before getting started, we just want to get a super quick sense of who is with us today, listening in. And so I've just launched a poll here. You can see that on your screen. It should pop right up, and we're just wondering what kind of organization you work with. Is it a first stage emergency shelter? Is it a second stage homelessness? Is it some other kind of supportive or transitional housing program? Or is it a whole other type of organization? In which case, feel free to let us know in the chat what kind of organization that is. So I'll just give people a few more seconds to answer. I see most people have done so. Please feel free to jump in there. Awesome. So I'm going to close that. And here are our results. So most of you, 57%, are with a first stage emergency shelter. And second to that, we have 24% from second stage, which is great. A few people from other types of supportive and transitional housing program, and a few others. So again, feel free to tell us more in the chat if you want. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Julie, our first presenter. And I believe Julie is going to keep her video off for this presentation because we were having a few internet issues. And I'm going to share the screen so you can all see her presentation. So Julie, over to you, and I'm just going to pull up the screen share.
Fantastic. So I'm going to begin by apologizing. We are in a rural area in Northern Ontario, so our internet is sometimes a little in and out and a little bit moody. So I apologize in advance if I happen to cut in and out. So my name is Julie DeMarquis, and I'm the Executive Director for Timmins and Area Women in Crisis. I've been in violence against women sector for over 10 years. And over and above that, I've been working community and social development for over 20 years with a background in marketing. So that's who I am, and I'm presenting on Musquat Transition Home. So if we could jump to the next slide. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous settler relationship of the populations who share the land on which I'm participating from the city of, which is on Ojibwe and Cree traditional territory of the Matagami First Nation people. Matagami First Nation is part of the Waban Tribal Council, which is part of Anishinaabe Nation, which represents Treaty 9 area. And I'd just like to say we recognize and deeply appreciate the historic connection to this place, to Turtle Island. We also recognize the contributions of Métis, Inuit, and other Indigenous peoples and what they've made both in shaping and strengthening this community in particular, and our province and country as a whole. And as settlers, this recognition of the contributions and historic importance of Indigenous peoples must also be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities, and in particular to bring justice for murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls across the country. So next slide, please.
And I'm just going to jump in, Julie. Just a quick reminder to you, Julie, just that we have the interpretation going, so not to rush through things. And just to everyone else, because there was a few questions in the chat, Julie's video is off just because of the internet connectivity. So just don't worry about that. Focus on the presentation slides and we'll move forward. So thanks, Julie. Back to you.
Okay, great. I'm getting messages that my cam is unstable. Want to put that out there, but okay, so we'll continue. These are the services that Timmins and Area Women in Crisis offers. So I'd like to highlight, we've had a sexual assault center since 1992. Her Place Women's Shelter came into 2010, and Musquat Transition Home in 2014. So, and we work from an Indigenous perspective. Our shelter has an Indigenous mandate, therefore, and that's always guided our work. Is we've always worked from a very feminist and cultural perspective. So you can see the remainder of our services there. I won't go into detail with all that because today's focus is on the second stage housing program. And I want to share that with you. Next slide, please. So the catalyst to the work to the second stage housing program was really when we were talking about how can we offer women leaving violence a real chance to heal and address long-term issues when shelters are really designed for a short-term stay with a 6-week stay, and rent and apartments are just so astronomically expensive. Shelters are at capacity. We need to find a way to get women out of shelter, but find a safe place that's somewhat affordable as well, and that's safe, right? That's really key. So that was the catalyst to the conversation, and we sat at a table. This was the challenge that we were facing as a tri-agency committee. So the tri-agency is there's 3 organizations in Timmins that we basically oversee 2 sexual assault centers and 3 women's shelters. And we came together and we were really struggling with some of these issues. So we connected with the CAO of the Cochrane District Social Services Administration Board. So our local social services. As victims of violence, they'd identified victims of violence as a local priority within their 10-year housing plan. So DSAB was also looking for a way to improve the long-term tenancy success of women leaving shelters. So with our conversations, they were able to offer to build a transitional housing with security features that women would need to feel safe, and to provide startup funding along with annual funding for second stage housing through their community homelessness prevention initiative. So the innovation behind this program is really providing Timmins women who are fleeing violence with up to a year to stabilize their lives in a secure, affordable home, thanks to the partnership between the 3 organizations and CDSAB. Next slide, please. So the lead partners in this program were Cochrane District Social Services Administration Board, and they were the building owner and the funder. Timmins and Area Women in Crisis was the project lead and a support provider. And then the other 2 shelters and the other 2 sexual assault centers were part of the planning committee in implementation committee. The people we served, basically women leaving violence who need additional time beyond the 6-week stay, and funding came through CHIPPY. So our guiding principles really and I think that I'm going to just quote what he said, what Brian Mark said from the CEO from CDSAB, because I think that's really important. He identified, when I came to this job, I thought CDSAB should manage everything. And I think that we face that a lot when we work with community partners. And then he continued to say, now I'm the opposite. I understand that our role as risk manager, if a nonprofit organization we fund fails, we are accountable. But if a provider can manage, why would we duplicate their efforts? And that's really important, because there was a lot of work acknowledging each other's expertise and acknowledging, because oftentimes folks come into this kind of work wanting to have full power and control, and they had to give up some of that power and control to allow us as the experts in VAW to provide some of that guidance and support, and have trust in each other, which you'll hear about a little later in the presentation. The next slide, please. So the development process. So Musquat was the first project of the Cochrane District Local Housing Corporation, which was a property development corporation. It was formed specifically to develop and invest in affordable housing. So the city of Timmins approached Cochrane DSAB, derelict property and tax arrears. And after the property's tenants were successfully relocated, the original structure was torn down. Over a 2-year period, the Housing Corporation worked closely with the municipal planning and building departments to develop the site, and with the consultation of the tri-agency committee, the VAW agency committee, during the design phase. That was key. We were involved from the very beginning. They didn't build it and then ask us. We were a part of the building. We were a part of that construction. They hired a contractor and oversaw the construction. In the meantime, the tri-agency committee used startup funds to get to develop policies, procedures, a job description, advertising to hire staff, purchase of furniture, and getting signatories in place. So that's kind of the work that we did. In September of 2014, the building opened up a unique 6-unit affordable housing complex that provided transitional housing support for victims of violence. So for the tri-agency committee, the biggest issue was trust. So we did a lot of, we had a lot of conversations, and often it was, okay, we need to trust each other in this process, that we won't let each other falter. And for us as a nonprofit, it's always about money. It's like, oh, where's the money going to come from? Where's it coming from? And they kept telling us, we won't let it falter. We'll take care of that piece if you can take care of yours. So that was really key. And their willingness to accept our direction in terms of security features and how the program should run went a really long way in fostering relationships. We can skip to the next slide. So the mission and vision, that was part of the work that we did. I won't go into detail with that, but the mission basically working as part of a holistic network to provide housing and equitable support services and empower women to live a life free of violence. And the vision to basically hopefully move towards having units across the region. Next slide, please. So next came the name. So the partners between DSAB and VAW all came together and had their staff and volunteers submit ideas around what the name should and could be. Musquat, so Aimé Lavoie's submission was the unanimous winner, and you'll understand exactly why in a moment. Musquat is the Ojibwe word for bear's den. So the city of Timmins is on Ojibwe and Cree traditional territory, as I explained. So using a word from a language that's Indigenous to this area really acknowledges the Indigenous settler relationship of the populations who we share the land with, and can be viewed as a small act within a greater process of decolonization. So this choice can also reflect our awareness and acknowledgement of the fact that Aboriginal women face disproportionately high rates of violence and often compromise the majority of our service users while still providing the French and English names for the space. So bears are ubiquitous in the Timmins area, and the image of the mama bear as both a great provider and a fierce protector is well established in our collective consciousness. So bear dens are made up of natural elements which protect and nurture the bear while it's vulnerable, and dens are not reserved for one class of bear over the other. They're reflective of the needs and desires of individual bears. A boar may happily crawl into the first hole it finds just as the season's about to turn down, while a pregnant sow may spend more time selecting just the right spot and bring in bedding and food for her young. So the female bear enters a safe place in her choosing and makes it a home for herself and her little ones during the difficult winter months. It's a temporary refuge. It is in fact a transitional home. So this name really captures both the spirit of the women and families who will call the transition house a home, while also capturing the essence of the transitional housing environment. So that was very, very neat. So next slide. Using the information from the name and some information in terms of how we wanted the logo to come out, we posted a submission to the logo tournament website, which has hundreds and thousands of designers, and this is the logo that came out, which was very reflective of the name as well, right? A tree growing and rerooting and the bear paws. So that's the logo. So wanted to share that very quickly with you. So next slide would be on the building and operations. So the building was a 6-floor, 1 3-bedroom, 3 2-bedrooms, and 2 1-bedrooms, all in a low-rise 6 blocks. The security features included monitored cameras, double security doors, panic buttons in all the apartments. Some of the things that we considered, if we were going to put air conditioning, that they shouldn't be window units, because that can pose a risk. That main floor windows shouldn't open. That there's safe viewing who's at the door through the TV. The tinted exterior windows so that folks couldn't see, and especially on the main floor, that the housing's in a safe area, that there's clear visibility of the grounds and in the building. And other safety features such as strategically strategically placed cameras and mirrors. So those were some of the building focuses. In terms of operations, TAWC basically leases, so TAWC being our agency, leases the property from CDSAB for market rent. We fill the vacancies in consultation with local agencies. So when there's a vacancy, we email our community partners to identify women who are interested without giving any key indicators as to who they may be, because we're still in a small community. We give a blurb to our advisory committee, and they determine which of the women that have been submitted would receive that unit that's coming up. So if there's a competition, if there's no competition and all works out well, then the women would automatically go. But if there's a competition, we have the advisory committee that decides. This way, it's not us that makes that decision. So there's no favoritism or any of those pieces. The residents get to stay for up to a year, and they pay rent that's set, which also includes their phone, their TV, their internet. We acknowledge that some women coming in often have outstanding expenses for hydro bills or cable bills. We didn't want that to be a barrier. We want to work on that barrier over that period of the year. So everything is already set and prepared for the women when they come in, fully furnished, all of those pieces. Now, the program does not offer rental housing under the Residential Tenancies Act. Women may be able to leave 1 year after entering the program or at any time if they don't comply with the program guidelines. So that was key, because what happens is when they fall under the Residential Tenancies Act, the problem is that if there's a problem with the rental agreement, it could take months and months and months before the landlord is able to have them, I don't know the wording because we don't use that, have them leave, ask them to leave the program. Because it's a program and we don't do the full year and it doesn't fall under Residential Tenancies Act, it's considered a full support program. So if there's a problem with a woman and her stay, she's not following the guidelines to ensure the safety and security of everyone, then she can be asked to leave the program. It's similar to a woman staying in shelter. She'll be asked to leave the program. Of course, we give some warnings, or we have very honest and open conversations with women. The intent is not for a woman to be put out, but they absolutely do have to follow the guidelines in order to ensure everyone's safety and security. And the other piece is, after a quarterly reconciliation, any shortfalls in the rent is met through CHIPI funding. So CDSAB has offered that piece, which is really important, because if we run low on funding, CDSAB will pitch in the remainder because it is market rent. So we could jump to the next slide. So the supports, basically TAWC provides a full-time second stage housing worker using funding from CDSAB. There's individualized support focus on preparing for independent living, such as prioritizing rent treatments, living within a budget, managing through unexpected difficulties. Staff also hosts monthly house meetings and individual check-ins to provide information on workshops, resume building. However, the aim is to encourage women to build relationships with services out the house so that they continue those relationships after they move out. The next slide, please. The benefits for the residents is they have access to their own furnished apartment in a seamless transition from the shelter into second stage, regardless of their income or credit rating. The supports are really tailored to their individual needs and access to a wide array of services, an opportunity to develop habits needed to manage on one's own, a community of women with shared experiences who can look out for each other, and assistance finding a permanent home, and a number to call after they leave the house. For CDSAB, basically it means fewer women returning to homelessness, victims of violence transition successfully into permanent rent geared to income or market rent from second stage, and lower costs to support women once they move to permanent housing. The next slide, please. So the benefits to TAWC is that we have access to 6-unit buildings The building-wide purchase availability for utilities and cable and phone and internet services to enable access for women with poor or no credit. Custom security features to provide survivors safe housing with no on-site staff. A property manager who's sensitive to security and confidentiality needs of the residents. Tailored access when vacancies arise with our advisory committee, as I've explained. Funding for second stage housing worker through CDSAB, startup costs, and a strong network of agencies. Next slide, please. So in 2017, the nonprofit housing sector is always looking for innovative ideas, whether it's to meet new needs or maintain strong outcomes in challenging times. So, and they've got their description of housing stability and innovation. And in 2017-18, the Ontario Nonprofit Housing Association received provincial funding for the Innovations in Housing Stability project, which profiled 8 unique initiatives that have helped diverse low and moderate income people to find and keep a home that might meet their needs. So these projects featured innovative approaches to addressing a range of complex challenges, but common elements that made them successful was that they were bold and forward-looking leadership. They had bold and forward-looking leadership, a willingness to collaborate, repurposing funding for a greater impact, and the potential to bring a lasting change. Next slide, please. So from Aboriginal families, seniors, and women leaving violence to the previously homeless or those struggling with mental health or substance use issues, that would make up the gamut of these 8 unique initiatives that were profiled. So Musquat Transition Home is there in orange. Now, Musquat Transition Home was also recognized in the Ontario Municipal Social Services Association's 2014 document enabling the service system management role in affordable housing and homeless prevention. So, and they highlighted 5 key examples throughout the province that were really innovators and solutions for affordable housing. So that's some great stuff. So the next slide, please. So the next slide is about advice for others. I realize the timing, so I need to just finish up. So similar projects in terms of advice must be led by VAW as we did. That's where the expertise is. There's a deep analysis needed in doing this type of work. And the fact that the relationship was a trusting relationship between VAW and Social Services Board was really key. Partners have to work on trusting each other. Trust is key. We need a good progressive board willing to try new things on both ends. Both boards have to be really open to testing out these waters. Using a design build approach for construction is really vital. So ensuring that we're VAW is a part of the initial design approach and a clear system for addressing rent shortfalls and at the outset is necessary. Then also help reduce the board's concerns. So that was the one issue that we did face, rent management necessarily. So about 9 months in, we were running a deficit because we weren't necessarily skilled in that. And we were supporting women coming in that we all know Ontario Works and ODSP is the Ontario Disability, what folks receive is really minimal in comparison to what they have to pay for rent. So we went back to CDSAB and said, this is not working. We need, we're running a deficit because we can't say no to some of these women. And they were able to provide us, if you remember, I talked about a quarterly reconciliation. So every quarter we submit, and they allow us to make that decision. We don't have to get their approval on if Jane Doe can pay $700 as opposed to the $850 rent. They leave that in our purview. That's the trust and expertise that they give us. And we believe that, we're all doing what's right for the women that we're providing service to. Next slide, please. So my quote is, our agencies put a lot of faith into each other. We had put our faith in CDSAB and believed they had our best interest at heart, and DSAB had to trust our VAW experience and expertise to develop the program. So that is my presentation. I realize I went through it a little bit quickly. Next slide, please. But my information will be posted on this next slide. And if you would like to connect with me about
Go ahead, Julie.
I think I fell off.
Yes, just at the last second. But yeah.
Okay, so the last slide was just my contact information.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
That's good. I got through it.
Yes.
So if you just wanted to share my information, if anyone is interested in connecting, by all means. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Julie. And I'm glad you made it through most of the presentation there without any other technical issues. So that was super interesting. We have a few questions that have come in already. I encourage people who do have questions for Julie to put those in the Q&A right now so you don't forget them. And I'll pass it over to Linda without further ado.
All right. Thank you so much, Leah. It is such a joy to be here. I'm honored to be able to join you all, and I will start my screen share and see how my tech capacity is. Okay. All right. So I'm hoping that that went fairly well, other than my bump. But anyway, I'm with the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, Linda Olson. I've worked at the coalition now for 11 years, and it's coming at the end of 35 years worth of working with survivors of domestic violence. I started in shelter in the early 80s. And one of the things that struck me about survivors coming into shelter were their pleas of, I didn't do anything wrong, why did I have to leave? And of course, the joys or the requests of being able to find a home to go to. So over my time of working with survivors, I've done, of course, emergency shelter, a couple of emergency shelter openings, a transitional housing program that was targeted for survivors struggling with substance abuse disorders, as well as mental health and domestic violence, and then rental assistance programs. And when I had the opportunity to go to the coalition to work on a special initiative that was funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation on housing, I just totally jumped on it in terms of the excitement of what is that next stage, that permanent housing, that sense of safety, stability, and healing. So the Gates Foundation had been quite entranced by the whole housing first approach. I would imagine many of you have heard of that. It certainly is present in Canada as well as the US. And for chronically homeless people, it seemed to have been working extremely well, great evidence outcomes. There were initiatives to expand that to other populations, veterans, youth, families. And so the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation came to the coalition and said, could this work for domestic violence survivors? So, you know, looking at, again, housing first, it's an approach. It's not a particular type of program. It's really the approach that recognizes the decades of, in the US particularly, discriminatory and inequitable approaches to housing. Many of the people who supported this initiative were pushing back against many service providers and funders who indicated that people needed to be housing ready, that somehow the homelessness was their fault, their deficiencies, and that in order to really get into permanent housing, they needed to complete some programs and jump through some hoops and just prove that they were really ready for their housing. And then one of the things that we talk about with Housing First is just because somebody gets into permanent housing doesn't mean that's the end. It's not housing only. So we started off on this adventure, and with my history in shelter, I was certainly there leading the choir in terms of, could this really work for survivors? What about safety? Don't survivors need to be safe first? We had many homeless programs that would not support a survivor in their transitional or permanent housing programs unless they had been out of a relationship for 6 months to a year. And so the question was, what were they supposed to do while they were waiting for that? The concerns about abuse or sabotage, legal issues, trauma, surely they were too traumatized in order to really cope with what needed to happen for housing. Discrimination, we've got such a long history of discrimination in this country, not just against BIPOC people, but also survivors of domestic violence, as well as those who have been incarcerated. Drug and alcohol abuse, don't they need to be clean and sober before they get housing? Income, and then of course the biggest concern is that we as the coalition were out to replace emergency shelter, which of course was the farthest from the truth, because as we all know, survivors need that special emergency safe place to go. So the initial investment was 13 agencies. We coordinated it. There was an evaluation component. And I know that I've got a link to that component, I believe. Half of each agency investment had to be used for completely flexible financial assistance as determined by the survivor. The other half was for infrastructure. And it was up to WSCADV to determine the service component. There we go. There's the evaluation. And of course, it was the evolving process of trying to figure out what worked the best. So it was an evolving program design. There's a link to the final evaluation, and you can see the different types of tools our evaluator used to say, is this successful? Do we even need to continue it? The foundation funded 2 rounds. We had cohort 1 and cohort 2 in the pilot, and included organizations that represent a wide diversity in Washington state, rural and urban. There were 3 tribal DV programs. There was an immigrant refugee specific program, a program specific to LGBTQ survivors, another program specific to Latinx migrant farm workers. So there was definitely a range, and trying to figure out what is the best service platform for that range of people. With chronic homeless folks, we know that the service package is focused on chemical dependency and mental health. And for us, we started with our survivor-driven, trauma-informed advocacy. Client-centered, survivor-centered, however you want to call that, is at the core of the work that we do. And of course, that has to be trauma-informed, not only for the survivors being aware of their desire for autonomy, personal control over their lives, but just also those choices that an advocate might not necessarily know is best for them. So the trauma-informed needed to be not only for survivors, but also the culture of an agency. And the piece that we added that was more unique and took us away a little bit from facility-based programs was the mobile advocacy, getting advocates out into the community working with survivors. Flexible financial assistance, as I've already mentioned, and community engagement, working in the community, and all on a platform of different housing responses. Here's a little bit more about mobile advocacy, and I'll just highlight that final bullet. As we found with this survivor-driven, really mobile advocacy specific by community, we found that the consideration of a survivor's culture and community really made a difference in increasing safety and rebuilding connections. I don't doubt that many of you are used to rural communities where everybody knows everybody and might have opinions about survivor choices and who they are. And what we found was working with organizations who are of and for and by the community that can really help to rebuild connections. The flexible financial assistance, completely flexible. And we'll keep on saying more about that because it can be such a challenge really to implement for folks. These are examples. It wasn't just related to utilities and rent, but this could be moving expenses, childcare, medical bills, back rent, debt, storage unit, you name it. People used it for all sorts of things that they consider was a challenge or an obstruction barrier to their permanent housing. This is the demonstration project. There's a report that I've linked here in the body of the PowerPoint. And this is just an example of our final 3 years of our demonstration project. The bottom box there on my right-hand side, 45% of survivors staying in their own home. You might remember my initial comments or impressions of survivors coming in and saying, why did I have to leave? Well, we found that out with our pilot project, that when given a choice, survivors would ask if the program could help them stay in their own home safely, have the person causing harm asked to leave, evicted, or leaving on their own free will, or perhaps just basically saying, we are going to make this a secure place, and the money that needed to happen for that. And also the money that might need to happen to sustain them economically for a while. So the first pilot, about a quarter of survivors stayed in their own home. The second cohort of that first pilot, half stayed in their own home. And here we've got our demonstration project of 45% staying in their own home, which gave them the advantage of being with their kids' school, the neighborhood that they're familiar with, and working on that community engagement. Really quick, advocates loved flexible financial assistance. They said it made it possible for them to say yes. And one executive director said it was the happiest money advocates have ever had. Community engagement. We've talked a bit about that and how important that can be, the buy-in for agencies that know their communities so well, and help survivors build that bridge back and increase the support networks by connecting or reconnecting them to their community. Rebuilding social network. And we found that that's led to survivor resilience and housing retention, and ends up being the most key to housing retention. The stability approaches in housing, our big platform. Of course, we use that diversion or homelessness prevention, the idea of you can leave temporarily and go back, or maybe they would never leave their home. We use rapid rehousing, which has been an initiative. It has to be flexible when it's too time limited. There are rapid rehousing programs in the US that are maybe only 3 to 6 months long. And as those of you who have just really gotten deep into transitional housing programs, 3 to 6 months might not be long enough as far as economic and advocacy support. So flexibly, and ideally going up to at least 2 years. Subsidized housing, we do have a housing choice voucher system that's funded by our HUD, our Housing and Urban Development Department, and having a housing choice voucher with the opportunity for DV advocacy services is ideal for many survivors because that's permanent. That doesn't go away. It's targeted toward their income. So as they make more money, they have a decrease in their monthly subsidy, but by that time they're on their feet and they're working on that increase. And finally, permanent supportive housing, which again is permanent and it's targeted to those with a disability. Sorry for the interpreter if I'm tripping over my words too much, trying to get through this relatively quickly for everybody. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation was impressed enough with the work that was being done, as well as the evaluation results, that they made another investment, another 5-year demonstration and research project with additional organizations. They invested in flexible financial assistance, since that tends to be hard to find. And they really intended for this demonstration project to be that little, hopefully, beacon of light out there for other funders, for foundations, for corporate funders, for community donors, for our public funding on all of our government levels. And so they invested in research, building the evidence. And this investment and all of the work that we all did together led to an investment also from our Health and Human Services at our federal level to do a longitudinal 24-month study to see how domestic housing first impacts survivors over time. This is being conducted by Dr. Chris Sullivan with Michigan State University. The funding has just been an amazing gift, building on what the Gates Foundation has already done. And it will, over time, see what happens if the particular pieces of our DV Housing First approach, specifically mobile advocacy and flexible funding, is any different than services as usual, which would be never just, but only shelter, only other sorts of programs that we've been operating now for a while, but really getting advocates into the community and providing housing within that community and supportive services. So that's what we're working on. I will say COVID has definitely thrown a kink into that. To our disappointment, but it's interesting. The first half of our sample actually was recruited and got through 24 months pre-COVID. So we're going to have a comparison between pre-COVID and post-COVID as far as what happens when a pandemic totally turns your whole way of operating upside down. So this is my contact information. Please feel free to reach out to me. There is a link that goes to our webpage, which includes a toolkit if you wanted more details about how to actually put something like this together. So hopefully, looks like we've still got 10 minutes.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you so much, Linda. It's so interesting to hear hear what you've been doing with this program. So maybe you can stop your screen share, and we will give people a few seconds. If you have questions for Linda or Julie, I encourage you to put those in the Q&A box. I think we have a few we can start with here from Julie's presentation, and then I'm sure a few more will come in as we do this. So I'm just going to sort of verbalize an exchange that happened in the chat here, because I think it may just have been visible to the panelists. So someone had asked Julie where the funding came from for the construction. And so Julie had just answered that the funding came from the Social Services Board, and they used homelessness funding for that. So just putting that there for anyone who wasn't able to see that in the chat. And then, Julie, I think we have a question here for you about how long it took to go from kind of the concept to operational status for Musquat Transition House, and what was the biggest problem faced in that kind of trajectory from the idea to being operational?
The idea. So when we connected with CDSAB, they were already prepared, and we had a quick conversation with them to say, you know, this is a problem that we're facing. They're the ones that came to us shortly thereafter, probably within, offered a potential solution. And from that date, it took 2 years from the concept to the full operational status.
And what was the biggest challenge in that kind of 2-year period, getting it off its feet?
I would say the biggest challenge, it was really to get our boards to trust each other. So when it came down to the, the brass tacks, the minor details, the security, they gave us full control. And depending on funding, and basically all of our requests were met, but it was about getting our board to that we didn't know if we were going to what that was going to look like, and it was really so built on trust and trusting that DSAB would not put a position that we wouldn't be able to get out of, and that's difficult as a non-fit face another organization just on your word, right? Because the boiler template was just the agreement was just a boiler template. It was really about our boards having those conversations and the CAO and myself working very closely together and trusting that we're going to make this work, and a piece to it. We just need to take care of making sure the program is running well.
Awesome. Thanks, Julie. And I know it was cutting in and out there a bit, but the key point I'm taking away from your answer is the trust that was really important between the two boards, which is a great thing to keep in mind for every project. So thanks for sharing that. So definitely put your questions into the Q&A box. While you're doing that, I have a question for Linda. So Linda, could you maybe tell us a bit about how like people enter into this program? Like, are they coming from a shelter normally, or it's sort of totally a separate type of referral program, or how do they get involved in this program?
For the organizations doing it, it was basically that first crisis line call where somebody would just beyond gauging the crisis and thinking about their immediate safety. The initial next questions, rather than these are the programs we have and here's an emergency shelter opportunity, the next question was, what do you need? What do you want? What would be helpful for you? And so what they found out, certainly some people said, I need emergency shelter right now, but they also found out that there were a number of people that had ideas of what would be helpful for them, either to retain their housing, to be safe in that home, or the dreams and visions of what else they might like to do. And what staff advocates tended to do was build on that. So they're added another sheet of paper to the intake package, which kind of indicated somebody would be, just ripe for that DV housing first. The idea of, would you like help with permanent housing? Would you like to stay in your own home? Is that something that would be of interest? So that's the way it started with the organizations. There were a total of 1920 who became what I would call a DV housing first organization. And other programs have picked up on some of those questions. Flexible financial assistance and the ability for an advocate to be mobile and to meet a survivor in the community where they designated a safe place was to meet, and potentially to do follow-up work in a home. All of that just took special training and skills and commitment by the agency. So, we're kind of integrating it into the way organizations do business and trying not to have it as this standalone program out there, but trying to have it as, what do you want to do beyond shelter? We kind of call our housing program sheltering to housing stability. So how do we think about all the different ways to shelter that can be that jump or that leap into stable and safe housing.
Awesome. Thank you, Linda. So I don't see any other questions in the Q&A or the chat, but I am going to give people, 30 seconds here to type out a question if you have one before we wrap up. And while anyone is typing, I'll just give a little reminder that when we do wrap up today, you'll see when you close Zoom a feedback survey, and we definitely encourage you to take a second to fill that in. It just helps us make sure we're continuing to improve our webinars. So not seeing any further questions. Oh, no, there's always one right when I'm about to close things. So this question, I think is probably for Julie, but maybe Linda afterwards, if there's any observations from your work, you can share as well. But the question is, how do you assist families with household startup when they're going from a furnished unit in a shelter and then, maybe they have nothing to kind of carry into their permanent home? So Julie, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, sure. So while they're staying in second stage housing, we have a sea container that's on site that allows us to get donations, put them in the sea container, and start building up for the woman. If a woman presents and she's got some furniture, we'll put that in storage as well. And then, or she has the option of bringing her own stuff in, and we'll put our stuff in storage. But during that year, we're really working with the woman to ensure that everything's in place for when she moves into her new apartment. The other thing is that community homelessness prevention initiative funding is also available. It's available in so many different ways that we can also provide support to help pay first and last month's rent and purchase much needed furniture and pots and pans and those types of things. Anything that she may not have been able to acquire, we're able to do a startup, and that is also funded by DSAB. It is their support of our program is really outstanding.
Awesome, thank you. And Linda, do you want to say anything quickly about what happens, if women aren't staying in their own home? What do you do about kind of furnishing and that kind of thing?
Well, of course, flexible financial assistance is often used for furnishing. The survivor is able to choose what it is they want and need, and also community partnerships. The partnerships, depending upon the size of community, either with different faith communities, thrift shops, furniture, warehouses. We use the whole range, and I've just heard of some very unique partnerships to support survivors in that way.
Awesome, thank you. Well, that's wonderful. Thank you to both Linda and Julie for your wonderful presentations today. They were so interesting. And thanks to everyone who's been listening in.